All right. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to CDP Presents, our monthly webinar series. It's so cool to see many of our friends joining us today, and we're happy to have you with us. If you've never joined us before, if you've joined us before, welcome back. I'm Bill Brim, the Executive Director at the Center for Deployment Psychology at the Uniformed Services University. If you have joined us before, you were probably expecting to hear Dr. Jenna Ermold, and so I apologize in advance for my lack of experience in this very important, critical introductory role. We have a great presentation for you today on debunking common misperceptions about sleep interventions from a bunch of super smart CDP subject matter experts and me. So I'll start off with our disclaimer. This project is sponsored by the Uniformed Services University. However, the information or content and conclusions do not necessarily represent the official position or policy of, nor should any official endorsement be inferred upon any part of USU, the Department of Defense, or the US government. Here's a snapshot of some outstanding upcoming training that we have offering coming up in the next few months. These can be found under the training tab on the CDP's website, deploymentpsych.org. We have several of our most popular EVP workshops coming up on PTSD and chronic pain. And for sure, be sure and check out next month's CDPP, Psychological Flexibility Training to Enhance Resilience in Service Members. Did you miss last month's webinar on dyadic interventions involving significant others in suicide prevention? Well, never fear. We have you covered. You can find the recording on our archive webinars page. If you attended and liked the webinar, please feel free to share it with your colleagues or friends, assuming that your friends are behavioral health providers or have a strange sense of entertainment. I suppose speaking of entertainment with a strong touch of the practical, CDP is excited to continue to offer our podcast, Practical for Your Practice. This bi-weekly podcast features stories, ideas, support, and actionable intel to empower providers to keep working towards implementing EBPs with fidelity and effectiveness. Be sure to check out all the fantastic episodes from season 1 on the podcast page of our website. And we are now well into season 2. So be sure and check out all of the great episodes to include the most recent ones on, so you want to be a military psychologist? Is there an echo in here? Just-in-time training and provider self-care in times of crisis. And practical for your and your clients' pronouns. What to do when your colleague misgenders a client. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Looks like the slides have gotten ahead of me, so I'll just jump right into enhancing your experience. Now that we've had enough self-aggrandizement, I'll introduce you. Before I introduce you to our panel for today, I want to make sure and take a moment to orient you to the features of Zoom that will enhance your experience in our training. You may have entered the webinar in full screen mode. Please click on your screen and hit the escape key, as this will make key features of Zoom more easily accessible for you. For the best user experience today, we recommend that you close all other programs on your computer. Any difficulties that you have viewing materials during the presentation are likely due to a poor connection or me just mumbling incoherently. While I'm talking, please check your volume level on your computer or device and adjust as needed. Many participants will find it easier to hear the presentation using headphones. Please note the chat feature, which you can find by hovering over the bottom of the screen. This is the place for you to enter questions and respond to questions that our speakers may pose, or even to interact with other participants. Questions will be moderated and asked of the panel in the final 10 minutes or so of our presentation today. Also, if you experience any technical difficulties today, you can use the chat and type the problem in the chat, and someone from our tech support team will assist you. Please make sure that you select everyone in the chat dropdown so that you may see your questions and not just the host and panelists will see them. This webinar series will be recorded and posted to the Center for Deployment Psychology website, along with any additional materials and references. The handout for today's webinar can be found in your CE21 My Account page under this event. Finally, at the end of our webinar today, our project manager, Mr. Micah Norgard, will provide information and instructions on how to obtain CEs. In order to obtain CE credit, you must attend the entire webinar and complete the webinar survey in CE21. Please note that for this webinar, we are offering CE credits as an approved sponsor by the American Psychological Association. These credits are acceptable to most state licensing boards for different mental health disciplines, but please be sure to check the requirements for your state and retain any documentation associated with the training. All right. For today's presentation, we have what we hope will be an interesting panel of CDP clinical health psychology experts. For the sake of time today, I will skip a detailed bio with this bunch, which would probably take at least an hour to get through, but you're welcome to read more about each of our panelists in your CE21 account page under this event. So here's the brief roll call. We have with us today Dr. Karen Lefkowitz, one of our senior trainers and who develops and delivers training and consultation in the evidence-based treatments of insomnia and PTSD. She is a CDP superstar expert, and so we're glad to have her with us today. Not to be outdone, Dr. Diana Dolan is also a senior trainer. She's an assistant director who currently oversees programs that provide evidence-based training for military-connected patients on a variety of topics. A fellow Air Force veteran, Diana has a diplomate in behavioral sleep medicine from the Board of Behavioral Sleep Medicine. Dr. Tim Rogers is also an assistant director at CDP. He's responsible for managing the development, delivery, and evaluation of a range of clinical training and research programs at CDP, as well as serving as a subject matter expert and trainer on evidence-based psychotherapies for PTSD and insomnia, also an Air Force veteran. Dr. Megan Paxton-Willing is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Deployment Psychology. She is our prolific researcher, and she has published numerous manuscripts on PTSD nightmares, sleep, PTSD, and TBI in active duty members. And last but not least, in addition to my role as your webinar MC, I'm also chairing the panel for today. I am Bill Brim, and I am a fellowship-trained clinical health psychologist and expert in behavioral sleep medicine. So that's the crew. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you. So some disclosures, all faculty, course directors, the planning committee. My slides are jumping around there. Sorry about that. Got to see the disclaimer, the disclosures, because it's important. Dr. Dolan, Lefkowitz, Rogers, Paxton-Willing, and myself have no financial interest to disclose, but this is going to come in handy here in just a minute as we have some additional disclaimers and disclosures to share with you as we get started. So getting started, today's panel is on debunking misperceptions about sleep interventions. Let's see if I can get this line. For this particular webinar, we wanted to make an additional pass at the disclaimer and disclosures beyond that general CDPP disclaimer that I just shared, as a model of one of the crucial aspects of evaluating products and interventions related to sleep. So take a look at this additional disclaimer where we make it clear that the identification of specific products, scientific instrumentation, or organizations is considered an integral part of the scientific endeavor, key to our discussion today, and does not necessarily contribute and constitute endorsement or implied endorsement on the part of the authors, DoD, or a component agency. Another key part, Dr. Paxton-Willing has collaborated with the Nightwear team on a grant that is currently under review. The Nightwear app is part of one of the products that we'll be reviewing today, and Dr. Paxton-Willing was blind and did not contribute to the Nightwear portion of the presentation. A key disclaimer to keep in mind, and an example of what you want to look for as you're kind of trying to weigh the effectiveness of different items that we may be talking about. All right, so the agenda. We're going to chat a bit first about why we selected this topic. We want to talk a little bit about how we selected the products or devices and give an overview of our evaluation process. Then we're going to go into the 5 selected products or devices. And then we'll share some final thoughts about the importance of evaluating products, not just for ourselves, but for our clients, and then wrap up with some time for Q&A. We have a couple of learning objectives. We hope that when you leave here today, you will be able to evaluate the quality of data for certain sleep interventions. And then we hope you will be able to apply an evaluative framework to the evidence for effectiveness for sleep interventions. So we want to start off with a few quick poll questions. Micah, if you can share poll number 1. All right, so there's poll number 1. Which of these interventions have you heard of for the treatment of sleep disorders? All right, I'm feeling excitement building. I can't see the news coming in, but I'm excited to see the results. We'll give you a couple more seconds. Which of these interventions have you heard of for the treatment of sleep disorders? All right, Micah, can you share the results for us? Yes, there we go. So nightwear app, good number, 10%. Melatonin, just about everybody. Weighted blankets, good. Binaural beats. Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right, so what about poll number 2, Micah? Can you share poll number 2? Where do you most often hear about new promising interventions for sleep disorders? Where do you hear from these usually? From the news, from your patients, from attending conferences, through social media, maybe from other professionals, or through journal articles? Where do you most often hear about new promising interventions for sleep disorders? All right, great. Let's take a look at the results for that one. All right. Very good. Yep. All right. Thank you for your responses. It seems these products and many others are in the consciousness at this point, and that we're hearing about them from a range of different directions, right? So we're hearing about them all over the place. All right. It's really, I think, probably safe to say that it's the wild west of caveat emptor out there these days, right? Since the QVC was started in the QVC channel was started in the mid 80s in one of my favorite places, Westchester, Pennsylvania, Corinne. Where that was the QVC was like when you could first like pick up the phone, you see something 24 hours a day, no matter what time, you could pick up the phone, you could order it right away and impulsively buy pretty much anything. Today, I think with the combination of TikTok and similar social media platforms and Amazon and similar kind of fulfillment centers, we've never been closer to impulse gratification and same day delivery than we are today. If you can't sleep, and you Google any question related to sleep, you'll be inundated with products and services, right? Mattresses and smart mattresses, pillows and body pillows and calming pillow spray, eye masks, weighted eye masks, Bluetooth enabled eye masks, weighted blankets, chain blankets, gravity blankets. You've got essential oils, CBD sprays, bath bombs, sleepy lotion, even melatonin bubble bath. We've got sleepy lights. We've got wake up lights. We've got salt lamps. You've got white noise, brown noise, relaxation, and guided meditations, hundreds of apps. You've even got pajamas with bioceramic print on the inside that reflect far infrared energy back into the body in order to promote cell regrowth. Real product. And one of my favorites, if you'll allow me to read an ad verbatim, a bedside caddy engineered to hold all of your pre-bedtime possessions, including, but not limited to, your laptop, iPad, phone, TV remote, glasses, moisturizer, and prescriptions. This way, you don't have to worry about getting out of bed once you start to nod off. Just put everything in its place and go with the flow. I mean, who wouldn't want that? Got to help sleep, right? It's a little surprise that with all these products that the sleep business is good business. And how good is it? Well, this chart from the Statista Research Department published this year reflects the growing sleep economy, which is made up of products, services, and applications connected to sleep and includes everything from pharmaceuticals, healthcare services, to furniture, to sleep products. The sleep industry is about 518 billion with a B billion today, and it's estimated to continue growing and be around $585 billion industry by 2024. With this kind of demand driving development and sales, we can see why this is maybe the birthplace of potential myths and scams. The internet and social media have become the snake oil salesman of the 21st century. And the principle of caveat emptor, that the buyer alone is responsible for checking the quality and suitability of goods before purchase is made, is simply not enough. How does the buyer beware? What should you do? What tools do you have to make an informed decision? So maybe the saying should be caveat emptor sed sapiens, let the buyer be knowledgeable. And that's why we're here today. We want to talk about how do you effectively evaluate the avalanche of sleep products that you're hearing about and that your patients are asking you about. So let me go ahead and get the panel in here, and we'll talk a little bit about the process that we used for evaluating the products, our evaluative approach, which is really the heart of what we want to model today and what we want to be as the main takeaway for our discussion today. Welcome. I'm going to use first name. So Megan, tell us a little bit about how these particular products were selected. How did we decide on these products?
Sure. So a lot of this actually comes down to some of those same questions that you just saw in the poll of where do you get your information from? So we thought about where we get our information from, whether it's the news articles that we see, the things that we hear from one another, the fads that pop up on social media. And then we also took into account the questions that we get asked a lot in consultation. And so we came up with these 5 as ones to model today. And this list is certainly not exhaustive. It really should just be thought of as kind of examples and a model for you to use to apply this framework to. So,
yeah, next time around, I wanna do a further dive on the ceramic lined pajamas. Tim?
No, I would just go ahead and say that kind of what Megan had mentioned, we see a lot of times when we do trainings, we'll get questions about various things that patients have brought up to providers, and people not always knowing what to say or how to respond to this. And what might be helpful for producing a good night's sleep might be very different for treating a chronic sleep problem such as insomnia, or treating something like obstructive sleep apnea. And so as we think about some of these things, it's important not only what we hear, but in what context do we hear it, and how can we evaluate that. So we'll definitely be bringing that up on our conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Diana, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the evaluative approach that you took with reviewing products, or at least one aspect.
Sure. So one thing that I think it's important to consider is, what are the claims based on, right? Where is the information coming from? And when we think about where we get information, if we look at news or what we hear online, someone else is interpreting that information for us. So we're basically trusting wherever we're reading that from to look at that, make the interpretation, tell us what to think about it. I think it's important, when possible, for us to go back to what is the actual place where that data is from, and for us to have the opportunity to make our own interpretation and determination. So when we're looking at some of these topics we're going to talk about today, but any claim about sleep, I want to know the source, right? Who is the one talking about this? Is this person someone that is known in the community? That would be helpful to know. I want to know who the funder is. That sometimes is buried at the bottom of the article, but that can tell you a lot. So not nearly as exciting as ceramic coated pajamas, but just the other day, I was curious about, coconut oil benefits. This article, I was reading about it. I found it on PubMed, and it was this article about how awesome coconut oil is. Nothing negative about it. So I scrolled to the bottom, and guess who it's funded by? It was something to the effect of the Coconut Oil Association of some. So clearly not an unbiased source there. And then we want to think about things like, is the data that the claim is based on, was it a small sample size? I've seen studies of 6 or 9 people, and then these large, determinations are made based on just a few people. Also, if you can only find one study out there to back up a claim, that makes me a little cautious too. I want to see that, there's more than one study, more than one context that we're able to see that this intervention or product is helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, a lot of these, as I was looking at them, as you're reading through news articles, often there will be a link to an article, or there will be an asterisk or some other kind of symbol at the in the article. But how many times do you actually scroll down all the way to the bottom and see what that asterisk or that research source was, or what the funding source was? Probably not as often as we should, right? Another aspect is, obviously, we talk about no research is perfect. So the lit review that you do, you're going to find research that no research is perfect. And so that's where the limitations of research and maybe the risks of using products that aren't supported comes in. I don't know, Megan, do you have any thoughts on that and how that played a role?
Yeah, I definitely think considering the limitations of the studies is a really important part in determining the strength of the evidence for something. How generalizable is it? Like Diana was mentioning, of not just the sample size, but who was in that sample. What was the race, the gender, the various breakdowns there. So certainly thinking about generalizable, is it going to be relevant to the patient that I'm talking to? But then in terms of just, relying on these treatments that may not have the same support, are we putting our patients at risk by delaying evidence-based treatments or these treatments that we work and so that we know work? So kind of weighing that as well as I'm looking at the literature. Is there substantial support there? Did I think the study was conducted well? And whether or not that article feels substantive to me.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up the diversity aspect of the studies, because I think we're so used to just kind of assuming the generalizability of research, and sleep is one area where we're learning more and more. I'm certainly learning more and more about that there may be differences in say, for example, race, and how sunlight may affect different races differently, and circadian timing, for example. So knowing what, and again, calling it limitations is not a bad thing. Every study has some limitations, but you need to be aware of what those limitations are before you can say to what extent do they apply to, like you said, the patient that's right in front of you. Corinne, would you like to weigh in on an aspect of the evaluative approach that you considered?
Sure. I will add into, first of all, I agree with everything that my fantastic colleagues have said so far. I'll add that sometimes it can be useful to look at the professional organizations within your field and see if they have made some endorsements. Every field of study has hopefully a respected professional organization. As a psychologist on a broad scale, I might look at what the APA recommends. And then, of course, there are sleep-specific societies like the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. And typically, if these reputable organizations endorse something, they have done a lot of this legwork for us. So they have taken the time to read the studies, think about the limitations, check into whether there's any conflict of interest that the product has, and they'll base their recommendations on all of that information. Now, Bill, to your point, this is another place where I think it's important for the buyer to beware and to make sure you're looking at a reputable organization if that's the approach you take, because I can very easily start Corinne's Super Awesome Sleep Society and endorse my trademarked pink sequin weighted blanket. But so if you don't do the research and find out that I'm not actually a legitimate sleep society, you wouldn't want to take my my endorsement as gospel.
Well, I would certainly consider it, though. I would certainly consider it heavily. Yeah, and I think that brings up a great point. I love that, mentioning that they do a lot of the legwork for you, and making sure that it's a reputable a professional organization, I think, is important. I always remember the 3 out of 4 dentists say, fill in the blank, right? I think that's an endorsement, right? And good to know who those 3 are. Probably more important, who was that 4th dentist and what did they say? All right. Tim, any thoughts on the evaluative approach and kind of some of the things that you considered?
Yeah, in addition to professional organizations, there are some outlets that I find are more trustworthy. So, just for example, if you're looking at blogs, even from our center, like we'll cite the research that we're quoting within there. But the Sleep Foundation .org, they have blogs that you can see. They're independently medically reviewed, fact checked by another person. So when you look in terms of the quality or source of information, there are some ways to kind of feel like you're getting better information. And what's really hard, or I think is harder, is when we talk about this promotional integrity that businesses have, that, obviously they have a vested interest to put their best foot forward. So it's really hard to look at those claims, and I feel like to always to evaluate those, because I think those are where I'm more going to cross check and see, yeah, they think it's the best thing, since sliced bread, but what have other colleagues have heard about this? Is there literature that supports this? Are people within various respected professional communities, are they talking about that? Are they endorsing it? Because just looking at some sort of package, I find really hard to assess the evidence of that. And I weigh that in context of also realizing that the placebo effect is actually a real phenomenon that occurs. So people can be taking some of these things, and their expectations or their hopes could also be another confounding factor in terms of how they experience this particular type of product. So I want to be really careful about just listening to that, and not necessarily sleep specific, but I think in New York, there's actually been some prosecution of the Attorney General going after app companies that did not show treatment fidelity to these principles and concepts. So, businesses may have some accountability, but sometimes it's always hard to know, who's really auditing and checking if all these claims are actually true.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And with promotional integrity, so many of these things are not considered medical devices, so they're not regulated by the FDA, for example. Some of them may have FDA approval for study, but that does not mean that they're necessarily approved for the use that they're being studied for yet.
Right.
I think with promotional integrity, I guess it's kind of is it Newton's third law of consumer protection, right? For each and every law protecting consumers, there's an equal and opposite law that protects the promoters, right? So you really do have to be kind of careful of first of all, probably quoting anything to do with Newton, and second of all, kind of the claims that that promoters make for their materials. Again, they may be grounded in a nugget of science, but how much have they extrapolated? Does the evidence support the actual promotional statements? I think is important to look at. So thanks. I think our approach was really designed to be rigorous, but also fairly easily replicated by anyone who's considering any of these products, right? It boils down to a critical thinking approach. Start with so to summarize what our experts have said, it sounds like we want to start with the product and its claims. Does the literature support the objectives and claims? How strong is that support, and in which ways may it be biased, and in which ways may it be limited? We want to be knowledgeable, especially if a patient comes to me and asks about using a particular product. You need to be able to respond and to address the risks. It's an informed consent, right? If a patient asks me about a product and I say, yes, you should use that product, I think that's covered by informed consent. We have to be informed, and we need to be able to discuss with them okay, here's the pros, but here's also the risks of using potential risks of and most serious harms that could come from using this product. And then circle back to the promotional materials. Are the claims valid? Are the claims supported? And is the product regulated in any way by reputable agencies? Is there hyperbole in the advertising? So what we're really focused on more is, in this talk today, isn't really the particular products that we selected. These were ones that we hear about often from our patients or in our training workshops, but we're more focused on the process and how we looked at each one of these products or services. So, all right, enough of that. Let's get on to the products and model a bit of our evaluative process. We'll start with Diana Dolan's review of nightwear. Diana?
All right. Thanks, Bill. Let's see. I should be able to move slides now.
And I'm certainly happy to do it for you.
Okay, well, I guess let's go next. I don't see the controls. So if you still have control. Oh, no, wait, I do see one.
Now you have control and I don't.
All right, there we go. All right. So jumped ahead and now I'm coming back. So you all got a little preview of everything. All right. So I noticed that when we did the poll, that one of the options that the fewest folks had heard about is nightwear. So let me tell you a little bit about this before we start evaluating some of the claims. So Nightwear is a privately held commercial medical device company, and they sell an app. It's used in conjunction with an Apple Watch. It's available with a prescription. So the prescription comes with the watch and the app. And it purports to use a proprietary algorithm that's based on heart rate and symptoms of stress to determine when someone is experiencing a nightmare. And then it purportedly uses vibrations to move the sleeper to a lighter stage of sleep, which is believed to end the nightmare early, perhaps so early that there's no awareness that a nightmare was present. Now, this app is marketed specifically for PTSD-related nightmares and not nightmares in general. And in a 30-day trial that's not been published in a peer-reviewed journal and not available outside the company, they say that a somewhat improvement in sleep quality, as measured by a commonly used subjective sleep study, the PSQI, or Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index scale, if any of y'all have heard of it, they talk about a somewhat improvement on that measure. Their hypothesized mechanism of action is that the alteration of sleep architecture, so the stage of sleep that the patient is in, heads off the nightmare, but it doesn't necessarily purport to address the cause or the triggers of nightmare. Nightwear notes on their website that it is FDA cleared. It touts a 2019 breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA and notes that they are FDA authorized on their site. So let's break this down and take a look at some of the considerations here. All right, so for starters, let's ask for the details when we evaluate this option. What is this proprietary algorithm and how was it developed? Were scientists and research involved? What sleep studies were used? The website describes the algorithm in a really cool way. It says it uses artificial intelligence and other cutting-edge smart technology. Neat. Except that tells us absolutely nothing about the product. It's just designed to make the lay reader who stumbles across the website feel like it does something. And if it actually does something, why don't they tell us what? What is being captured here? Now, it's interesting because they don't tell us what specific sleep parameters it's based on, and we're not sure if an Apple Watch might accurately capture those yet. Research on consumer devices shows that they do still have a ways to go in terms of valid sleep measurement, like total sleep time and sleep onset latency. And importantly, we need to know, is a nightmare actually occurring when sleep is disrupted? Was this ever studied? How often is sleep falsely interrupted? All right, next, let's take a look at the outcomes here. The ostensible outcome of improved sleep quality doesn't relate to the nightmares themselves. Why not? If this device treats nightmares, why aren't nightmares the reported outcome? Now, as far as I can tell, there's no peer-reviewed published data on this device out there. There is a mention on the site of one study of 70 persons submitted to the FDA, but I couldn't readily find a copy of the details. When you click on the references on their site, it just says data on file. I spent hours combing through the website. I went through link by link. I finally found at the bottom of one of the pages a small link that went to the results of a 30-day comparison of those 70 folks. And the actual data showed that for the marketed outcome, the PISCI, which I mentioned, there's only a 1-point difference between the device and sham, meaning that both the device and a placebo, a sham, led to improved outcomes. They're only 1 point apart. There were no statistically significant differences on any other outcome, not depression, not PTSD, not experience of nightmares, not the self-rated nightmare score, none of those things. Next, we want to look at the hypothesized mechanism of action. Night wear is purported to work by determining when the wearer is having a nightmare using what appears to be heart rate. So assuming the heart rate sensor is accurate, does heart rate predict when a nightmare is definitively about to happen? Can heart rate elevate without a nightmare, or a nightmare occur without heart rate elevation? A recent line of research has actually shown that elevated heart rate may not precede nightmare arousals. And then finally, just thinking about the marketing, which always kind of sets off, alarm bells in my head. As mentioned on the previous slide, the device is marketed as FDA authorized and a breakthrough therapy designation. Again, neat, except let's clarify what that means. There's no official FDA authorization for a product or medication. It simply means that the FDA authorized Nightwear to market their device based on the expectation that the device is low risk. It's not based on the device itself. So it's kind of a confusing phrase. And as for the term breakthrough therapy, this is simply a voluntary designation that the disorder the intervention purports to treat is a life-threatening or debilitating condition. And as such, the intervention is going to receive more expedited review when it is submitted to the FDA. Now, because nightmares are the breakthrough therapy, any intervention that's aimed to target nightmares would apply to this same designation and use the same term. So anything submitted to the FDA to treat nightmares can be touted as a breakthrough therapy designation. So just some things to think about as we evaluate. So to kind of conclude my thoughts on, when we evaluate the claims of this device, regardless of all these questions, I would say that a fundamental issue here is the underlying cause is not being treated. Nightwear is specifically designed for trauma-related nightmares. And as a behavioral health provider, I'm speaking for myself, I'm quite frankly disappointed at the language on the website that says no other treatment for nightmares is FDA approved. And Nightwear says that on their website. Of course not. Behavioral treatments aren't subject to the FDA process, and behavioral treatments do work, in particular for nightmares related to trauma, by treating the trauma. In fact, a study of soldiers found that only 13% of them had residual nightmares after effective behavioral treatment for PTSD. So I think a patient with nightmares related to an underlying trauma should receive treatment for that trauma. It's not clearly stated on the device website that is the case. And not to mention the concerns about prioritizing an external device over the importance of behavior change for patient self-efficacy. I really worry about how this may affect a vulnerable patient's sense of helplessness or locus of control. Will they need this device forever? What happens on nights when the device isn't available or working? I also find the lack of transparency, the way the marketing language is worded, and how they didn't address the role of trauma or mention behavioral treatment concerning, to say the least. And by the way, last note before I turn it over, did I mention that in the user agreement for this product, you relinquish your rights to your data? So I don't know about you, but my spidey senses are tingling here. Based on what I see right now, I don't know that I would recommend this app at this time.
Outstanding. Thanks, Diana. And so far, quote of the day belongs to you, which is FDA authorized is neat. Great. Thank you so much. All right. Let's move to Megan, who's going to talk about probably the most commonly discussed item that we get asked about in our training, both the CBTI for insomnia workshop and in our advanced circadian rhythm workshop, melatonin. Megan?
So I definitely agree. I think of all of the things that we're going to be talking about today, melatonin supplements are probably the most common. And looking at the poll results, I'd say that's probably true. So today I'll specifically be focusing on melatonin dietary supplements. These are not FDA approved for any indication and differ from prescription melatonin receptor agonists, which are FDA approved for the treatment of insomnia. And melatonin supplements are really quite popular these days. They're available over the counter at your local pharmacy, on Amazon, on pretty much anywhere you might look for your vitamins or other supplements. And these are intended to supplement the melatonin that's naturally produced in the body And this is primarily produced in the pineal gland or a little bit in the retina in response to the darkness to help regulate your circadian rhythm. Melatonin supplements are typically made from synthetically produced melatonin, but they can also be made from melatonin produced from animals or microorganisms. So it all depends on which supplement you're looking at. But the most important thing here is that they are a supplement. And as such, the FDA does not regulate it the same as it would if it were a medication. Okay. Oh, things are jumping a bit, I apologize. Melatonin dosage is typically 1 to 10 milligrams, and they come in a number of forms. We have them in capsules and tablets, which I think is probably the most common still, but they're now also being sold as gummies and liquids and drops, some drink mixes, and just a lot of different ways. As Bill mentioned earlier, as bath bombs even. And this is a point that we're going to come back to in a moment. When I began looking at the evidence for melatonin in treating insomnia, I was just overwhelmed by the hundreds of peer-reviewed articles that were out there on the topic. So to help focus my search, I did two things. First, I limited my literature review to articles published in the last 10 years. 10 years tends to be the number that a lot of folks will use in terms of determining recency and relevance to a topic. And then the second thing I did was I paid particular attention to meta-analyses and systematic reviews. And this was to help correct for publication bias, because significant results that are in support of the researcher's hypothesis are more likely to be published. And these meta-analyses and systematic reviews will pull these file drawer data to help balance out and give a more unbiased view of the literature. So when I began sifting through these articles, the thing that really stood out to me was just inconsistency. I'd look at one meta-analysis that showed subjects taking melatonin fell asleep a few minutes faster, and they stayed asleep a few minutes longer, and they reported better sleep quality than patients receiving a placebo. But then the next meta-analysis would say there was either no or little difference between these patients. And as I read further into these meta-analyses, there were just a ton of debates on concerns about dosages being used differing, the results being so vastly different between studies, the study quality being considerably variable. But then the other thing that really stood out to me was just a debate as to, for these studies that are showing significant improvements, is it actually clinically meaningful? Like I mentioned, people were saying these meta-analyses were showing a few minutes. So it was like 5 to 7 minutes of falling asleep faster and staying asleep. So is this a clinically significant number? And I think all of this evidence is just best summarized by a quote that I found when I was reading the position statement of the Insomnia Study Group from the Spanish Sleep Society, which was just basically that despite the undeniable theoretical appeal of this approach to treating insomnia by using melatonin supplements, there's just little scientific evidence that supports its use as a substitutive therapy. So after reviewing the literature on the effectiveness, the other thing that I wanted to look into was about the supplements themselves. Like I mentioned, they're not FDA regulated. And so that was a little bit of a concern for me. And in digging into this piece of it, it probably led to my biggest concern with the use of melatonin supplements, and that's related to safety. So because the melatonin supplements aren't regulated, there's been some issues with their composition over the years. There was a recent study that went out, the researchers bought dozens of melatonin supplements from their local pharmacies and Targets and things like this, and compared the amount of actual melatonin content in the medication, in the supplements, to the content that was listed on the label. And in more than 70% of these supplements, they were more than 10% off of the labeled amount. And some of them, it was so off that the actual amount of melatonin that patients would have consumed was more than 4 times the amount that was listed on the label. So really a significant difference there. And knowing the amount of medication that someone or a supplement someone's taking is incredibly important and can present safety concerns. Thinking about older patients in particular, because melatonin may stay active in their systems for longer than our younger patients, can have effects on daytime drowsiness and concentration and attention and things like that. But the second finding from this study that was really concerning to me was that more than a quarter of the supplements included serotonin. And so people were taking serotonin without their knowledge. How is this interacting with their medications? And the final piece of safety for me was that melatonin was being ingested by children in large amounts. They're now being sold as beverages and gummies, and so kids think they're snacks. And melatonin is now the most frequently ingested supplement being reported to national poison control centers in children, with just the rates skyrocketing over the last few years. And the final thing that I looked at here was what were the professional organizations saying? The American Academy of Sleep Medicine recommends against for insomnia, but recommends for circadian rhythm disorders. And the Society for Behavioral Sleep Medicine supported that same statement. The American College of Physicians said insufficient evidence, but the American Academy of Family Physicians recommends for insomnia in older adults. And in the international community, it was pretty much the same thing. Some found insufficient evidence, some recommended against, some recommended for. So when I take all of this into account, I would not personally recommend melatonin at this time for insomnia. I just think there's still a lot more that we need to know about it, and some stronger support for it, but would recommend melatonin for use in circadian rhythm disorders like jet lag, because of stances from some of these organizations and the support there. Keeping in mind, being careful of which supplements I chose, focusing on ones with like the USP symbol, as recommended by the AASM.
Perfect. Thanks, Megan. And we'll have Tim coming up next, talking about one of the ones I found most interesting, which is mouth taping. But with melatonin, I think one of the big takeaways for me is, kind of its role given its role in the circadian rhythm, it's very interesting. And that field is very rapidly evolving. And I think, a big takeaway from me is kind of the importance of keeping up on the literature. Something I heard about melatonin even a couple of years ago may no longer be accurate or may have evolved since then. So thank you very much, Megan. I appreciate it. All right, Tim, I got to tell you, I've been really anxious to hear about this one. So take it over.
Thanks, Bill. So I want to talk to you now about the intervention of mouth taping. And it didn't seem like this was as well known to folks when taking the poll. And I had to admit that this was something that I wasn't initially as aware of. This was something colleagues had brought to my attention, and apparently is something that is being discussed a lot on social media platforms. And again, I would caution people with that because it's very hard when people give anecdotal information. They don't necessarily always share all of their medical information or things that may be helpful in terms of to actually interpreting why or how this actually may have been beneficial for this individual. So I want to be clear that I'm going to actually be talking about mouth taping as an intervention, particularly within the context of a treatment for obstructive sleep apnea. Now, obstructive sleep apnea is one of the most common sleep disorders, and it's a condition that involves difficulty with breathing while sleeping that results from a partial or complete obstruction of a person's airway. So when we think about mouth taping, the proposed mechanism of action for this intervention is that when you tape your mouth, you begin to breathe through the nose, and it helps actually change the angle of the palate and the tongue, which can help to open the airway. So you can see the difference via the images on the slide. So on the left-hand side, you have a person who's breathing through their mouth, and you can see how the tongue is causing an obstruction in their airway. And then the right-hand side, you can see with the mouth that is closed and taped shut, you can see how the tongue hangs differently, where it allows now more of an open airway passage and allows for a person to actually breathe better. One of the things I'll say, though, is that there's very little peer-reviewed research on this as an intervention. So one study that I found by Hung and Young in 2015, they had a relatively small sample, so about 30 subjects, and they examined the effects of mouth taping on patients with only mild OSA. And what they found was that there was a decrease of hypoapnea index events from about 12 per hour to only about 7.8 or roughly 8 per hour. what's important, and as Megan was talking about discussing the clinical significance for this, right? A diagnosis for OSA requires that you have more than 5 apneas per hour. So in this study, looking at people who only had mild OSA, while they found improvement in terms of a decrease going from 12 per hour to only 8 per hour, patients were still in a clinical range for OSA symptoms. And that's a concern. And if that occurred for those who are only experiencing mild OSA, only experienced this kind of minor reduction, it would definitely raise potential concerns for those who had more moderate to severe symptoms, right? And so, again, something that we want to be really careful of not just, it improves their sleep-related breathing, but by how much? Because people who have OSA experience significant psychological symptoms, cognitive symptoms, and a wide range of physical health problems, cardiovascular in nature. So just for example, like hypertension. So not things that are trifle. So people might be curious about this and thinking about, well, what kind of tape do people use? I know I had that question, right? Well, the key thing here is that you want to make sure that you're using the right kind of tape. So you're not using duct tape, you're not using masking tape or Scotch tape, but you're using porous tape for human skin. So things like hypoallergenic tape, surgical tape, athletic tape. And there's principally 2 methods that people use that are demonstrated as visual aids on the slide. So you can either use a 1/2 inch or inch tapes, either starting at the philtrum across the lips, halfway to the chin, or going from left to right, from the left commissure to the right commissure. It's also recommended that you always fold over a loose end about 2 to 3 millimeters to create a handle to remove the tape, to make it a little bit easier to take off. Also, if this is going to be used for children, the children need to be able to apply the tape themselves, and they need to be able to remove it themselves, particularly if they have difficulties breathing through their nose. Just for example, like if someone had a deviated septum. One of the things that has been brought up or talked about was this issue related to informed consent. So when you're talking about using novel treatments or things that maybe these other agreed upon treatments, right? Going over potential side effects. So on this slide, it covers those things. Things such as irritation around the lips, pain upon removal, disruptive sleep due to a difficulty with nasal breathing. So an example of that, again, would be a deviated septum. Anxiety. It might not be too surprising that people putting tape over their mouth can produce some anxiety, right? Discomfort with the tape. And then again, this was mentioned before, but could this potentially delay more effective treatment? So when evaluating this, one of the things that I wanted to note is, first of all, that mouth taping as an intervention for obstructive sleep apnea was not recommended by any clinical practice guideline. So not the DODVA clinical practice guideline for the treatment of insomnia or OSA, not by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine for their clinical practice guideline for OSA. I could find no endorsement by any professional organization, psychological or more sleep focused. There was very little peer-reviewed research. So ultimately, in terms of kind of my summary, in terms of recommendations, is that if a patient reports having difficulties with breathing, they should get evaluated by their medical doctor for things like asthma, for things like allergies. If they're reporting difficulties with sleep-related breathing, they should get screened for OSA using an empirically validated tool such as the STOP or STOP bang. And if they screen positive, they should be appropriately referred to their PCM to get in for a sleep study. We want to encourage the evidence-based treatments for OSA. So the positive air pressure, so using the CPAP machines for the duration of their sleep period. And the importance of thinking about things like that informed consent and talking about some of those potential risks, factors, or side effects of these novel or other agreed on treatments if they're going to proceed with that. what really kind of sucks for us is that in this case for like OSA, we have no way of, objectively measuring these apneas that people could be experiencing at home. That would need to be monitored more by, like a polysomnogram to measure and assess for that. So even subjectively, if a patient was reporting that maybe they're getting something better for that, but they still haven't been evaluated by the physician, they still haven't been evaluated by a sleep clinic to see what's really going on with their OSA, I would still be thinking that would be really important to do.
Thanks, Tim. I really appreciate that you highlighted and focused in on, kind of the risks and not just the risks. The chat really lit up. There was lots of discussion about the, dangerousness and the potential contraindication. So we have a lot of great critical thinkers on the webinar already. But I really appreciate that you highlighted those risks and talked about the importance of discussing alternatives, evidence-based alternatives with your patients. I know, a lot of comments that, mouth taping probably works for kids if kids are your problem, waking you up in the middle of the night. But in all seriousness, and I'll talk about weighted blankets here in just a second, but it kind of the other end of the spectrum of dangerousness, I think, probably in a lot of ways. But I think, as you mentioned, there's a lot of talk about mouth taping, and it's become kind of popular on some of the social media. And I think it just highlights something that's really important. And everyone sleeps, and most people have experience with sleeplessness. But if you have had insomnia or other sleep disorders, it's very painful. I'm preaching to the choir. Obviously, it affects your life in a range of ways, and I think it results in some desperation to try, anything that even remotely makes sense.
Right.
And so I appreciate you, kind of highlighting the risks and the importance of getting evidence-based, more gold standard interventions, especially for something that's so dangerous like obstructive sleep apnea. So
well, and I'll just briefly mention that I think that there are some health benefits through breathing through your nose. And so this is an example of saying, okay, well, if there's a lot of health benefits here, then shouldn't this automatically apply to in this context? But that's why it's really important that we look at, this intervention for this specific problem and what is the evidence of that, and not just kind of just overgeneralizing things.
all right, great. So I have weighted blankets. And to be honest, when I drew this one for my evaluation, I did not have a warm, fuzzy feeling about it, pun intended, I guess. So I wanted to start from the beginning and inform myself a little bit about this product and its history, because weighted blankets have been around for a while. We know that professionals such as occupational therapists have long used deep pressure touch to help calm children with autism spectrum disorders. And it's thought that deep pressure touch can help with stress and anxiety. And there are numerous studies over the course of the last 40 plus years in the occupational therapy and autism related literature supporting the use of swaddling and deep pressure stimulation using weighted blankets or physical touch. Now, weighted blankets are typically filled with either plastic pellets or glass beads that make them heavy. Historically, some have had, and some of them still do have, chains in them. So think like a knight in chainmail, or imagine the lead vest that you wear during a dental X-ray, but on a bed-size scale, right? They range from anywhere from 3 to 30 pounds, and they range in price from about $70 to over $300. Of interest to us is that devotees say that they can ease anxiety, that they will give you a good night's sleep, and that they treat insomnia. And that they're based essentially on this idea of deep pressure stimulation, which is gentle pressure kind of applied all over the entire body. Kind of imagine being wrapped in a comforting swaddle or a tight hug. And this triggers a parasympathetic nervous system response that reduces heart rate and blood pressure and helps you to feel more relaxed and less anxious. Manufacturers recommend that the typical adult will use a blanket that's equal to about 10% of their body weight for optimal comfort. And for children, it's 10% plus maybe 1 or 2 pounds. As for thickness of the blanket, that's kind of determined by the filler. The glass beads used in weighted blankets are pretty small. They're much smaller than the plastic pellets, so that makes them typically thinner than the plastic pellet blankets. There are blankets that use things like bamboo as a cover material that can kind of help with cooling if you're too hot. And then some of them come with extra filling in case you tend to run cold and you want to feel more warm with your weight. These are not medical devices, so claims are not directly regulated by anyone. So ultimately, the question is, do weighted blankets work for treating insomnia? And the answer is maybe, right? So if you search online, you'll find dozens of weighted blankets for sale. They make a wide range of claims, but unfortunately, studies of their effectiveness, particularly for insomnia, though, are harder to come by. Generally, studies have shown that weighted blankets may be effective in some situations for some people for reducing anxiety, and therefore indirectly may affect sleep. In one study of 32 adult volunteers, 63% reported lower anxiety after lying under a 30-pound blanket for 5 minutes. Now, assuming that all the people in the study weren't 300 pounds, that was probably a pretty heavy blanket for many of them in a very short amount of time, but did report lower anxiety. It doesn't say whether they reported lower anxiety after the blanket was taken off of them or not. I'm just kidding. Another study tested weighted blankets, unspecified weighted blankets in 30 people who'd been hospitalized for a mental health crisis, and 60% reported lower anxiety after using the blanket. So it sounds promising. But studies directly connecting weighted blankets to insomnia are even less conclusive. And there just isn't a high enough volume of weighted studies on weighted blankets yet today. On the other hand, there is no evidence against weighted blankets either. And plenty of people swear by them. Anecdotally, people say they're helpful. It is true that deep pressure stimulation may seem to have a calming effect for some people. It might take you kind of out of your anxious thoughts and help you feel more focused on the physical sensation, so kind of a distraction, or lower your blood pressure and heart rate, and resulting you feel less anxious and may reduce sleep onset latency. But the studies are, as I said, inconclusive. There have been 2 fairly recent studies that I would highlight, to kind of show you the kind of the freshness of the discussion right now. Aaron et al. Published in 2020 in the American Journal of Occupational Therapy a systematic review of weighted blankets, and they looked at the time 8 very limited peer-reviewed literature studies, and concluded that weighted blankets may be an appropriate therapeutic tool for reducing anxiety, but that there was not enough evidence to suggest that they're helpful for insomnia. And one that got a fair bit more press in 2020 and was highlighted on the American Academy of Sleep Medicine website, and therefore, I guess, a semi-endorsement, since it was in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine in 2020, is Elkhorn et al. They had 120 patients who were randomized to either a weighted chain blanket or a light plastic blanket for 4 weeks. They used ISI, the Insomnia Severity Index, as well as daytime activity logs, sleep logs, so subjective logs, and actigraphy. And at 4 weeks, there was significant advantage on the insomnia, on the self-reported ISI, the Insomnia Severity Index ratings, for the weighted blanket intervention over the light blanket. At the 12-month follow-up point, those that had continued to use the weighted blanket, in other words, the ones that found it helpful and continued to use it, continued to maintain the effect. And patients who had used the light blanket were given the choice of trying the heavier blanket, and those that made that choice had a reduction in their ISI similar to the participants that had used the heavier weighted blanket from the beginning. So their conclusion was that weighted chain blankets are effective and the safe intervention for insomnia in patients that were in their population, which is major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, ADHD, and may also improve daytime symptoms and level of activity. Interestingly, in that study, the weighted blankets did not have a significant impact on total sleep time or WASO, wake after sleep onset time. But patients reported felt that they had an improvement in their ability to attain and maintain their sleep. So interesting in regards to the self-report for that subset of patients. Bottom line, overall, way too early to draw any scientific conclusions. The current studies are relatively small. They have limitations. And there isn't great research yet that says weighted blankets make a big difference. I want to take a quick second to look at the pros as described in on Google and various promotional materials and some of the cons. Improves sleep and well-being. No significant evidence to support that other than what I just mentioned. Provides extra comfort and warmth. No doubt there, I'm sure. Boosts mood and concentration. Anxiety, yes. Depression, maybe. Concentration, I could not find any studies that directly related weighted blankets to improve concentration, other than maybe the extra leap step of, if you're less anxious or depressed, then probably your concentration is a little bit better. I found it interesting that it helps pregnant women. It didn't really say how, but the supposition that I could find is that weighted blanket, the blanket's added weight aids in the reduction of inflammation and swelling that women experience during pregnancy. But again, I saw no evidence to support that. Reduces anxiety, yes. Restlessness, maybe. Depression in one study, but was less supported. Helps with brain function. Couldn't find anything that directly indicated that, other than, again, the leap beyond the research, which suggests that stress and anxiety may be reduced. Helps with chronic pain. Maybe. There's some limited support. There was a small research study that found that pressure applied to the body reduces pain reflexes in individuals with chronic pain. So again, a leap that maybe therefore a weighted blanket would reduce pain because it reduces pain reflexes. Deep touch promotes melatonin production. Not directly supported. I did find that there's lots of things that stimulate and reduce melatonin secretion. We talked a little bit about light and dark, but also there's one study about using music therapy. There's one pilot study about reflexology treatment, and interestingly, swimming, at least if you're a rat that's thrown into a pool. Weighted blankets help releasing serotonin, which helps with, quote, severe mood swings that pregnant women experience. No evidence was provided or found on that. On the con side, might take some getting used to. It's more expensive than a regular blanket. Not recommended for babies under 3. Hard to take on travel. Imagine weighted chain blanket through TSA, and it's just heavy. I want to foot stomp that it is not recommended for people with breathing related sleep disorders, and that's not clear in the promotional materials that I saw. It is not recommended as a first line treatment for patients with sleep disorders in general, including insomnia, certainly not over evidence-based treatments. The research is limited. However, it is generally positive for anxiety and potentially insomnia, and but it did not have a significant effect on total sleep time or wake after sleep onset, and objectively measured in that one study. And the concern is that it's seen as a quick fix that could delay seeking more effective treatment. So I guess if you're willing to shell out a couple $100 for a weighted blanket, it might be worth a try. But if you have significant anxiety or sleep difficulties, a blanket alone is not likely to fix it. I'll call this one as a lot of hyperbolic claims where promotional materials go way beyond the evidence for most people at this point, but that if anxiety is an issue, they may help and may indirectly help with your sleep. So that's weighted blankets. And now I'll turn it over for our, now I'll turn it over to Corinne for our last item, and that is binaural beats. Corinne?
Thank you, Bill. I think the timing is actually pretty good because I think I'm going to end up in a very similar mindset or a very similar conclusion that you did with weighted blankets. So I'm going to talk about binaural beats to wrap things up. And I saw in the poll earlier that about a quarter of you have heard of binaural beats before. It is fairly new strategy to me that I actually heard about from participants in our CBTI workshop the last few times that I've been teaching it. So this has come straight from all of you who have attended our workshops before. For the 75% of you who haven't heard about it before, let me do my best to try to explain what it is without getting lost in the weeds. So binaural beats refers to two different sound waves being applied simultaneously to your ears at the same time, so within two nearby frequencies. So the idea, for example, is you might get a 250 hertz tone being presented in one ear, in your left ear through headphones, and a 256 hertz pure tone being presented to the other ear. The theory is that not only can your brain recognize the differences between those two frequencies, which would be 6 hertz, but it would also be able to hear this sort of third phantom wave, that sound wave that's in that 6 hertz frequency. So I know that sounds very sciencey, which means it must be true. Absolutely. That doesn't tell you as much, I think, as listening to an actual excerpt of it or an example of it. So I did get permission from a YouTube content creator who's been making binaural videos for some time. He goes by the username Phi Tribe, and you see one of his screenshots here. And I'm also going to hopefully play you a sample here of what it might sound like. Or not. Oh no. Thank you, Micah. So I think we could all agree that is a delightfully soothing sound that is created as part of this video. And if you were listening to it with headphones, what you would experience is that there are two different tones or frequencies that were being presented to each ear. And theoretically, your brain noticed a phantom third wave that was in the 4 hertz category. What the heck does that mean to us? Well, to take it one step further, if you believe that you could hear a third wave without recognizing it, there's also a further assumption, a further theory that we can actually entrain our brains to respond to that third beat. And certain frequencies are associated with different moods or behaviors, like some tones might make you feel happy, and some tones may be likely to help you fall asleep. So if we can create that third phantom frequency that aligns with, say, delta brain waves, then the theory is we should be able to help insomnia by entraining our brains to sleep. And the very fancy terminology for that is entrainment of neural oscillation. So I think you'll agree that sounds very sciencey. And certainly the warning label on this YouTube video suggests that this is serious business and that binaural beats are incredibly powerful. So all of this made me want to be a believer. I wanted to buy the binaural beats, or actually get them for free on YouTube. But does the research hold up? Does the research demonstrate that binaural beats can help with insomnia? Unfortunately, as of right now, no, that evidence is just not there. In looking at the research literature that's out there, I was able to find 4 recent studies on binaural beats, and none of them made a strong case for treating insomnia. First, 3 of the 4 studies focused on healthy participants who didn't have any sleep problems whatsoever. And they even ruled out common comorbid issues like anxiety disorders and substance use disorders. So that left really healthy young individuals who were already getting good sleep even before using binaural beats. We talked about research methodology earlier. Unfortunately, much of the research was pretty poorly designed. So they often had no control condition or no placebo condition. So there was nothing to compare the binaural beats to. And the sample sizes tended to be very small, ranging from the smallest study with 14 participants to the largest study with 43 participants, which are all considered pretty small ends. Some of the studies further clouded the data by including instructions or variables that we know are going to promote good sleep anyway, such as giving participants guidance to keep a regular sleep and wake schedule and to avoid using caffeine and alcohol during the study, all of which we know is going to help promote good sleep. And then finally, as you heard in that audio example, often binaural beats are embedded in relaxing or soothing music or soundscapes, and often have soothing visuals associated with them as well. So of course, that's going to promote relaxation and perhaps help us feel more sleepy. That said, there was one well-designed randomized control trial that focused on participants that had subclinical insomnia, so insomnia that didn't quite reach that clinical threshold, but certainly had some difficulty sleeping. In this study, there was a control group, and they listened to music only, whereas the experimental group listened to music combined with embedded binaural beats. What did the results show? Unfortunately, no significant differences in variables like sleep onset latency, total sleep time, or scores on the insomnia severity index. So there wasn't really any difference when we looked at individuals who are having difficulty sleeping. The one positive finding from that study is that individuals who listened to the binaural beats did report improved daytime energy levels. So there was that. Pulling that all together, what do I make of this? Well, in conclusion, there just simply is no evidence that binaural beats improve sleep in individuals with insomnia because it literally has not been studied as far as I can find. There is some evidence that binaural beats can help with things like shortening how long it takes to get to deeper stages of sleep, like N3, as well as increasing the amount of time that healthy sleepers stay in N3 sleep, and increasing daytime alertness, again, in young, healthy individuals. There's an extra caveat that researchers and audiologists think that probably these benefits are not going to extend very much to older individuals because our ability to hear and process the differences in frequencies declines with age. So we're not going to be able to perceive that binaural beat, which of course would be likely to limit the benefits that we get. As I mentioned, binaural beats are often combined with music and other soothing stimuli that decrease arousal. So like a weighted blanket, why not? Sounds nice, sounds lovely. I like nice music and nice visuals. So pulling it all together, it's generally a safe approach. It doesn't have a whole lot of risks. And it's certainly, we could certainly posit that listening to binaural beats would reduce arousal. So with that in mind, there's no reason to think that it can't augment gold standard interventions for insomnia, like CBTI, especially as it could help to reduce hyperarousal, which is a component of CBTI. But unfortunately, the research is just not there to suggest that on its own, binaural beats are going to have an impact on insomnia. Sorry, guys.
Dang it. There goes my whole retirement plan of becoming a binaural beatboxer. Yeah, sorry. No. Okay.
I hope you've diversified your retirement plan a little bit, though.
Right. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And what I took away from a lot of these is that while the evidence may not be strong for, and with some exceptions, there may be some dangers associated with using the products, that the biggest takeaway in some ways for me is that the importance of not letting using these products interfere with getting professional help for a sleep disorder and using the evidence-based treatments, that they may be complementary or alternative products to use, but that the research supporting them specifically for treating insomnia or whichever sleep disorder they were applied to is really just not in that place yet. So thank you everyone for your you're breaking down your evaluation of our selected products. There was lots of great comments in the chat. Let me get back to my notes here. Lots of great comments in the chat about, especially early on, about the limitations and some examples of limits in the generalizability of studies, taking into account gender, taking into account races and things like that. We had let's see, I wanted to go to, we did have a couple of questions regarding melatonin that I wanted to get to. Again, great comments from folks on maybe suggesting other things for our next look at myths related to sleep products, and talking about other complementary and alternative interventions for sleep, diet, and lots of foods were discussed. One thing that came up was tart cherry juice being used as a melatonin supplement. I don't know if you came across any of that, Megan, in your review. I feel like I've heard a little bit about this, especially as a recommendation to older adults for whom endogenous melatonin production may be waning. But did you come across cherry juice in your reviews? And I guess we can get all the panel back on here.
I did not see anything about tart cherry juice. I haven't heard of that one being used for sleep in the past, but it doesn't mean that somebody hasn't looked at it before.
And I don't know if there was a comment, if anybody on the panel had come across, there has been, I've noticed in primary care, there was a mention of more patients coming in, having been started on hydroxyzine for sleep, which is, I guess, kind of today's Benadryl in a way, because it helps to reduce anxiety and may help with the onset of sleep, maybe as a secondary effect. I don't know have any of you come across or heard anything about that?
I've been hearing a lot about medications in general as I sorry, I just saw a comment in chat that distracted me. I've been hearing a lot about medications in my BHC consultants, in my BBTI consultation. I see that Lauren Pace is on here, by the way. Hi, Lauren. And it's been coming up more and more. And for a long time as sleep behaviorists, we really pushed against using prescription medications for insomnia because the research, as we know, as many of us know, shows that the results don't last for very long and they don't target the underlying causes of insomnia. And I will say that I think for a long time, I was personally hearing that was happening less and less frequently in primary care, that people were getting prescribed medication much less frequently and being referred for CBTI or BBTI instead. But unfortunately, even as of the call that I just had this morning, I've been hearing that there's been a lot more move back towards prescriptions like benzodiazepines and hydroxyzine and things like that.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. All right. Well, I wanted to kind of reach out in the chat to you guys because, again, really appreciate your comments and not a ton of questions, but great comments. Like I noticed someone mentioned the dog in Corinne's background. Dogs are great. Someone mentioned dogs in lieu of weighted blankets as a bed partner. So that's good. So we appreciate the comments. I'm wondering in the chat, though, patients come to us all the time asking about, hey, I heard about this, I heard about that. Maybe in the chat, could you share some of the ways that you evaluate products or complementary and alternative options for your patients? How do you evaluate them before you recommend? What kind of tools do you use? What do you find helpful? And while those are coming in on the chat, I know we only have a couple minutes left, but I was wondering, like, for our panel, any last minute thoughts on kind of tips or top 5 tools that you found helpful to use with when you were evaluating these products?
I always have something to say, Bill. So of course I have tips and thoughts. But I think one thing that I would pass on to everyone is people have had sleep problems for what, thousands of years? I mean, since people have had sleep problems. And how likely is it that of all of the things we've talked about, that one of these things is somehow the magic bullet that hasn't been tested before? I think it's understandable that we would want to think there's something we're missing, that there's some magic bullet that we can tell our patients about. But the reality, in my opinion, is that sleep problems can be complex, right? They need more than just a Band-Aid. And we have evidence-based treatments that work. So, rather than sitting around kind of going, is it this substance or this thing I can buy, this something external, I would want to maybe think about what of these things we're talking about, what do they add to the evidence-based treatment for that? What do they do that the treatments that we have that we know are effective don't already do, and do without the patient maybe having to buy a product for the rest of their life or something like that. So I'm a little biased because I'm one of our CBTI trainers, but behavioral treatments can't be taken away or lost. And I think they really empower patients in a way. All of these things we're talking about can be taken away as something external. It's not behavior change.
And if I could, I also want to put in a plug here for case conceptualization. Not just us, how we understand the patient's problem, but how are they understanding their problem, and how do they understand what it is that they're proposing to do, and how does that make sense given their understanding? And so we just know from like common factors that having a shared understanding of what the problem is and agreement upon the intervention and why and how that works for them leads to just good outcomes in general. So I think that can often be a good place to start to bridge, especially if we don't understand something or the patient's more knowledgeable about going back to that conceptualization and getting an understanding of how does that piece of the puzzle fit in.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Tim. And Heather mentions the same thing in her comment, and she talks about the importance of discussing the patient's motivation for using that particular product. I think that's a good point along the same lines. Corinne?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. I had another thought too, which really is to piggyback off of what Diana started mentioning, that, hey, I'm one of those people that has struggled with insomnia from time to time as well. And I wish I could find the right juice or the right tea that would just address that issue for me and have it done. So I'm right there with you, understanding that we wish there was an easy cure. I would suggest, whenever we're thinking about a new product or something that a patient is asking us about, as practitioners, we want to start with the gold standard treatment. We want to start with the evidence-based treatment and go with what is most recommended by the research, by professional organizations, et cetera. If those don't work, then I think it's really reasonable to think about what other options are there, how do we incorporate, how do we augment, et cetera. But I get a little bit concerned when we start thinking about procedures that don't have a lot of research base instead of beginning with those that do have an evidence base. And for those in chat who worry that we're not going to recommend anything, I promise, stick with us long enough, we will recommend treatments for things like insomnia and sleep apnea.
Perfect. Thanks, Corinne. I think that's such a valuable note as well. And I think, Catherine mentions kind of the same thing, starting with kind of the peer-reviewed literature, the peer-reviewed publications, and look to reputable organizations like Johns Hopkins or Cleveland Clinic or Mayo Clinic and those kinds of places as a start. I think a lot of it comes, kind of word of mouth, I think, from other folks. And I think even though the word of mouth may be from one of your colleagues, it's worth asking that colleague, what did you base your recommendation that you're telling me on, kind of what is that information come from that you're recommending this with your patients? Because I think it boils down to, we as clinicians have a responsibility, as we said at the beginning, towards our patients, and informed consent for when we do make recommendations, including recommendations like CBTI and VBTI and IRT and ERRT for nightmares and insomnia. But also for anything complementary and alternative that they may come to us with. Any closing thoughts from our panelists? We have 1 minute left before we need to turn it over to Micah and send people on their way.
Bill, if that's all right, I would note that we're going to do a follow-up blog based on everything we've talked about today. I think it's going to be posted on the CDP site in a couple of weeks. So you all have had amazing comments in chat and important considerations. And so we'll have the blog to touch base on some of the things we didn't get to cover today. So thank you all.
That's great, Diana. And I think the chat is full of things for our next iteration for debunking common misperceptions about sleep. So thank you for the recommendations and ideas in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us today. Micah, I will turn it over to you, sir.
All right, thank you everyone. Momentarily, I'll go ahead and post a link here in chat. That link will take you back to your My Account page. And all that we ask that you do is once it says that your seminar is complete, go ahead and complete the evaluation, and then you'll be able to print out your certificate. If for some reason after 2 hours it states that you have not completed the seminar, go ahead and shoot me an email and I'll take care of that for you. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get this room shut so that we can get the attendance taken. Thank you for all the presenters and the panelists.
Thanks, Micah. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to hearing from you.